Welcome into the archives. Tonight, you are stepping into a world where time does not tick, buzz, or glow. There are no minutes to chase and no alarms waiting to interrupt you. Time here is quieter than that. Before modern clocks, before watches lived on wrists, and before schedules ruled the day, people organized their lives by light, sound, habit, and patience. Days stretched and shrank with the seasons. Work began when it could and ended when it had to. You are about to explore how time was actually organized before modern clocks. Not poetically, not nostalgically, but practically. You will see how sundials worked, how bells controlled entire towns, how monks divided the day, how labor followed daylight, and how early clocks quietly changed everything. If this journey into historical time management before modern time measurement produces the ability for you to relax and fall asleep, then please consider liking this video, ringing the bell, and subscribing to the channel so that time will not catch you avoiding future trips back into the archives. So get comfortable, lower the volume just enough, and let the modern world fall quiet. Time is about to move much more slowly. You are standing in a world where time has no independent existence. There are no instruments to consult, no numbers to check, and no external authority telling anyone what moment it is. Time is not something people referenced. It was something they encountered. What you see first is the sky. Light arrives gradually. Darkness recedes. The sun rises, not as a signal, but as a condition that makes activity possible. This was the earliest and most durable input into time organization. Human activity followed light because it had to. Historically, timekeeping systems at this stage were not systems in the technical sense. There were no devices, no schedules, and no abstractions. Time was embedded directly in environmental change. The sun's position determined visibility. Visibility determined what could be done safely and accurately. Nothing more complex was required. Processes followed physical thresholds rather than temporal units. Work began when enough light existed to see tools, terrain, and materials. Travel began when paths were visible. Precision tasks were postponed until lighting conditions improved. Activity stopped when darkness reduced accuracy or increased risk. Maintenance requirements were non-existent because there was nothing to maintain. There were no moving parts. There was no calibration. The only requirement was attentiveness, which was reinforced through daily repetition rather than formal instruction. Seasonal variation was not an inconvenience. It was foundational. Longer summer days allowed extended labor, construction, and travel. Short winter days compressed activity into narrow windows of light. This variation was not corrected or standardized. It was accepted as a structural reality. Logistics adapted accordingly. Agricultural cycles aligned with daylight availability. Storage was emphasized before winter. Repair and indoor work increased during darker months. Planning assumed variability rather than consistency. Failure points existed but were environmental rather than mechanical. Cloud cover obscured solar position. Storms reduced visibility. Smoke interfered with light. When these failures occurred, activity slowed or stopped. No penalties followed. There was no concept of lateness because there was no schedule to violate. Coordination was inherently local. Communities shared time because they shared the same horizon. Distance disrupted synchronization. A sunrise visible in one location might be delayed elsewhere due to terrain. Large-scale coordination was therefore limited. Long-term consequences of this arrangement included low urgency and high adaptability. Tasks were completed when conditions allowed, not when a unit expired. The system absorbed disruption easily. It bent rather than broke. You notice something else as you observe this arrangement. Time does not belong to anyone. No one enforces it. No one controls it. It unfolds without regard for intention or preference. There is quiet irony here. The system is both absolute and indifferent. The sky does not negotiate. As darkness returns, people rest, not because they are instructed to, but because darkness removes alternatives. As you continue watching daily life unfold, you notice that people do not remain satisfied with undifferentiated daylight. Over time, repeated observation produces categories. The day becomes segmented, not by numbers, but by recognizable conditions. The inputs remain solar. Light intensity, shadow length, and temperature shifts provide the raw information. The transformation was conceptual rather than mechanical. People assigned names to recurring environmental states that supported different types of activity. Morning was not a time unit, it was a condition. Morning began when light became usable. This threshold varied by season, weather, and geography. Morning supported preparation rather than intensive labor. Animals were tended, tools were gathered, and movement began. Midday occurred when the sun reached its highest visible position. Historically, this was identified through shadow behavior. Shadows shortened, paused, and reversed direction. The heat peaked. Visibility was optimal. Labor intensified because errors were less likely. Late light followed as shadows lengthened and temperatures declined. Tasks shifted toward completion, travel slowed, storage and cleanup increased. The system emphasized closure rather than urgency. Dusk marked the transition from reliability to risk. Precision tasks ended, firelight replaced sunlight, and night began. These divisions described conditions, not durations. Morning did not last a fixed length, neither did midday or dusk. Each segment expanded and contracted with the season. Seasonal variation reshaped the entire structure. In summer, midday dominated the day. In winter, midday compressed while twilight expanded. No attempt was made to normalize these differences. Behavior adapted instead. Maintenance of this system relied on a shared understanding. Communities broadly agreed on when midday occurred because the sky provided visual confirmation. Disputes were rare and easily resolved. Failure points included atmospheric conditions that flattened contrast. Fog obscured shadow behavior. Overcast skies removed reference points. In these cases, people relied on habit, bodily cues, and memory rather than observation. Coordination improved modestly. Agreements could now be framed around parts of the day. Meet at midday, return by dusk. Precision remained unnecessary because tolerance windows were wide. Long-term consequences included a deep integration of time with bodily sensation. Hunger, fatigue, and temperature reinforced divisions. Time was felt internally as much as observed externally. Ritual also became possible. Certain actions consistently occurred in the morning or at dusk. Repetition stabilized behavior across generations without requiring instruments. You notice the quiet confidence of this arrangement. The day is divided without pretending it will ever behave consistently. As night returns, people rest, knowing tomorrow's divisions will resemble today's, but never duplicate them. You are now seeing something new appear in the landscape. A fixed object stands where people gather, a stone slab, a vertical post, a wall with markings. Unlike the sky, this thing does not move. It waits. Historically, this marked a significant transition. Timekeeping began shifting from pure observation to reference-based interpretation. The input remained in solar motion, but the transformation became geometric. Early sundials worked by introducing a fixed vertical element, later called a gnomon. As the sun moved across the sky, the gnomon cast a shadow. That shadow changed position and length in a predictable daily pattern. Time was inferred from where the shadow fell relative to known reference points. These were not abstract calculations, they were empirical systems. Markings were established by observing shadows at consistent moments across many days. Knowledge accumulated slowly and locally. Sundials were immobile by necessity. Their accuracy depended on latitude, orientation, and alignment. A sundial that functioned correctly in one location produced inaccurate readings if moved elsewhere. Even small shifts in placement introduced error. Construction required care rather than complexity. The gnomon had to be upright. The surface had to remain stable. Markings had to remain visible. No single error ruined the system, but small errors accumulated. Maintenance became unavoidable. Stone eroded, wood warped, metal corroded, moss and dust obscured markings. Someone had to clean, repair, and occasionally remark the dial. Timekeeping now consumed labor. Seasonal variation introduced complexity that early systems did not attempt to correct. The sun's arc changed throughout the year. Shadows shortened in summer and lengthened in winter. Early sundials accepted unequal hours. An hour was defined as 1/12 of available daylight. Summer hours were long, winter hours were short. This elasticity was considered normal. The system aligned timekeeping with lived daylight rather than uniform abstraction. Downstream systems adjusted automatically. Work periods expanded and contracted. Prayer intervals shifted. Meals drifted. Everything stretched together, preserving internal coherence. Standing stones served a different function. They did not track daily progression. They marked seasonal thresholds, solstices, equinoxes, agricultural turning points. These structures aligned sightlines with solar positions on specific days of the year. Standing stones were calibration markers rather than clocks. They anchored the year rather than the day. They helped communities anticipate seasonal transitions critical to survival. Failure points were clear. Cloud cover rendered sundials unreadable. Night disabled them entirely. Indoor spaces offered no access. Sundials required daylight, visibility, and patience. Long-term consequences were subtle but important. Time became externalized. It existed outside the body. Disputes narrowed. Authority began attaching itself to reference points rather than memory. You can sense the irony. Precision is pursued using a system entirely dependent on clear weather. As the sun sets, the shadows disappear and the reference goes silent until morning. You now notice that time is no longer confined to sight. It travels. Historically, visual timekeeping solved the problem of reference but created a new limitation. Sundials required attention. Fields, workshops, and interior spaces prevented constant observation. Time needed to reach people where they were. Sound provided the solution. The input remained solar observation or ritual schedule. The transformation became acoustic signaling. Time was announced rather than read. Bells emerged as the dominant technology. They were difficult to cast and expensive to maintain. Bell production required specialized skill, significant resources, and substantial infrastructure. Installation required height and structural support. Bells did not measure time. They announced decisions. Someone had to determine when they rang. That determination depended on upstream systems such as sundials in courtyards, observation from towers, and religious schedules. Habit was reinforced through repetition. Bells amplified whatever timekeeping logic preceded them. Maintenance grew complex. Bells cracked under stress, ropes frayed, and towers shifted. Bell ringers had to be present and attentive. Errors were public, and everyone heard them. Seasonal variation remained embedded. Bells rang earlier in summer and later in winter for the same named events. Sound marked sequence, not duration. Failure points multiplied. Wind carried sound unevenly. Fog dampened the sound, and distance delayed the perception. Two listeners heard the same bell at different moments. Precision was not the goal. public sound reshaped daily life. Work began when the bell rang. Markets opened and closed by sound. Prayer aligned across households. Time became centralized. Authority entered decisively. Control of the bell meant control of rhythm. Most people responded rather than decided. Long-term consequences included dependency. People watched the sky less. They listened instead. Time shifted from observation toward instruction. You can sense the quiet change in power. Time no longer belonged only to the environment. It was now mediated. As night approaches, the bells fall silent, and another system prepares to take over. You are now watching time become intentional. Within monasteries, time was no longer allowed to drift according to convenience or weather alone. It was structured deliberately, repeatedly, and with consequence. This was not done for efficiency. It was done for order. Historically, monastic communities were among the first environments to require consistent daily scheduling across long periods. Their motivation was religious obligation rather than economic output, but the logistical outcome was one of the most regulated time systems in pre-modern life. The primary input was doctrine layered onto solar reality. Sacred texts and monastic rules specified when prayers were to occur. These moments were arranged in a fixed sequence known as the canonical hours. Matins occurred during the night. Lauds followed near dawn. Prime marked the beginning of the working day. Terce, sext, and none divided the daylight hours. Terce, or 9 a.m., sext, or noon, or none for 3 p.m., measured times of early prayers. Vespers were the prayers that occurred in the evening. Compline concluded the day. These were not equal units of time. They were ordered obligations. Their sequence mattered more than their duration. The transformation here was procedural. When a canonical hour arrived, activity stopped. Prayer began. When prayer ended, work resumed. Time functioned as an interrupt rather than a background condition. Managing this system required constant attention. During daylight, sundials were commonly used to estimate the approach of canonical hours. At night, monks relied on water clocks, candles of known length, or observation of stars. None of these methods were precise. Maintenance demands were high. Water clocks required steady flow and frequent refilling. Candles burned inconsistently depending on composition and airflow. Sundials depended on the weather. Errors accumulated daily. Correction was routine. The system did not expect perfection. It expected discipline. Deviations were noted and addressed through repetition rather than recalibration. Seasonal variation intensified strain. In summer, daylight offices stretched. In winter, night offices extended deeply into darkness. Sleep was fragmented by design. Fatigue was not a failure. It was part of the discipline. Failure points were primarily human. Oversleeping disrupted the cycle. Inattention caused misalignment. Weak enforcement allowed erosion. The system functioned only through collective compliance. Long-term consequences extended beyond monastery walls. Canonical hours influenced nearby towns. Bells rang for prayers that lay people began to recognize. The idea that time should be segmented, repeatable, and obligatory spread outward. You can see the quiet shift. Time here is no longer simply observed. It is imposed, not to increase speed, but to enforce order. As night returns, monks rest briefly, knowing the next interruption is already scheduled. Outside institutional settings, time remained practical rather than doctrinal. Labor systems prioritized completion over duration and reliability over precision. You see work beginning not at a number but at a condition: visibility, safety, and readiness. Historically, most labor was organized around tasks rather than hours. A day's work was defined by what was produced, not by how long it took. Fields were ploughed, tools were shaped, and batches were completed. The primary inputs were daylight availability, task complexity, and social expectation. Work began when light allowed accurate effort. It ended when light failed or the task reached a natural stopping point. The transformation was task-based. Time served the work rather than governing it. Maintenance of this system relied on memory and reputation. Workers remembered how long tasks typically took. Peers observed effort. Disputes were resolved by precedent rather than measurement. Seasonal variation dominated everything. Summer workdays were long and physically demanding. Winter days were short and constrained. Obligations adjusted accordingly. The system expected imbalance. Logistics adapted to light quality. Precision tasks were scheduled near midday. Cruder labor occurred during lower light. Travel planning accounted for visibility rather than distance alone. Failure points arose during transitions. Twilight blurred boundaries. Weather interrupted progress. Tools broke. Animals fell ill. The system absorbed these failures by delaying completion rather than penalizing lateness. Long-term consequences included resistance to standardization. Punctuality mattered less than dependability. Skill outweighed speed. Efficiency was tolerated but not required. You can see the resilience built into this approach. The system bent easily. It absorbed disruption without collapse. As evening approaches, work slows naturally, not because time has expired, but because conditions have changed. You are now watching time operate under its most restrictive condition. Darkness removes visibility, compresses options, and increases risk. Every system built on sunlight either fails outright or must be replaced. Historically, night forced a redefinition of timekeeping priorities. The goal was no longer to track progress through the day. The goal was to survive the absence of light. The primary input at night was risk. Fires were spread more easily. Theft was harder to detect. Movement became dangerous. Timekeeping transformed from measuring passage into managing responsibility. The dominant system was the night watch. Instead of dividing time into equal units, communities divided responsibility into shifts. These shifts were known as the watches. Depending on region and period, the night was divided into 3 or 4 watches. These watches were not equal in duration. They were functional assignments. Each watch corresponded to a span of vigilance rather than a precise length of time. When one watch ended, responsibility passed to another group or individual. The transformation was organizational. The system tracked who was accountable at any given moment rather than how much time had passed. Sound became the primary signaling method. Watchmen announced the hour, called out the changing of the watch, or reported conditions. Bells, horns, and shouted calls served a critical function. They confirmed that someone remained awake and alert. Sleep patterns adapted accordingly. Continuous, uninterrupted sleep was not expected. People woke during the night to tend fires, animals, or children. In urban areas, the presence of a watch normalized interruption. In monastic environments, fragmented sleep was already routine. Maintenance of the night system was fragile and entirely human. Watchmen fell asleep. Cold reduced alertness. Weather dampened sound, and alcohol interfered with judgment. Enforcement relied on fines, corporal punishment, or public shame. Seasonal variation amplified strain. Winter nights were long and exhausting. Watches were extended. Fatigue, of course, accumulated. Summer nights were shorter, and vigilance became easier but less critical. Failure points were immediate and consequential. Silence signaled danger. If no call was heard, uncertainty spread quickly. Sound functioned as reassurance as much as information. Long-term consequences included a fundamentally different relationship with sleep. night was not treated as a single block of rest. It was a managed interval of partial sleep and shared responsibility. You can sense the quiet tension of the system. Darkness is not measured for understanding. It is divided for endurance. As dawn approaches, the watch dissolves and responsibility returns to daylight systems. You are now watching time detach itself from the sky. Historically, mechanical clocks did not emerge because earlier systems failed completely. They emerged because institutions desired consistency independent of weather, season, or observation. The motivation was reliability, not comfort. The primary input shifted from solar observation to stored mechanical energy. Weights suspended by ropes provided force, gears transmitted motion, escapements regulated release, and time was generated internally rather than inferred externally. This represented a fundamental transformation. Once set in motion, a clock continued regardless of daylight, cloud cover, or season. It divided the day into equal units, even when lived experience disagreed. Early mechanical clocks were large, expensive, and inaccurate. They were typically installed in towers where their weight and size could be supported. Portability was impossible. Precision was limited. Maintenance demands were constant. Weights required daily winding. Gears wore unevenly. Lubricants degraded. Temperature changes affected expansion. Early clocks gained or lost significant time and required frequent corrections. Seasonal variation was not eliminated. It was ignored. Mechanical clocks imposed equal hours that conflicted with daylight reality. This produced friction between clock time and solar time. Failure points were numerous. There were power failures when weights ran down. Mechanisms jammed. Bells struck incorrectly, and noise became a complaint. Reliability remained aspirational for centuries. Despite limitations, clocks spread, not because they were accurate, but because they were authoritative. They produced time without needing to observe the sky. Long-term consequences accumulated gradually. Equal hours enabled contracts, wages, and coordination across distance. Time began detaching itself from environment and embedding itself in institutions. You can observe the quiet shift. Time no longer required attention. It required maintenance. As night falls, the clock continues to move, indifferent to darkness. You are now watching time change ownership. As mechanical clocks spread, timekeeping ceased to be merely a shared reference and increasingly became an instrument of authority. The question was no longer how time was observed, but whose version of time governed daily life. Historically, institutional control over time emerged gradually. Cities, churches, guilds, and ruling authorities determined which clock, bell, or signal counted as official. The primary input at this stage was power rather than sunlight. Tower clocks were placed deliberately in prominent locations. Height ensured that sound carried and faces were visible, but symbolism mattered just as much. Time was broadcast from above. It was not requested. It was declared. Bells linked to mechanical clocks replaced bells linked to observation. The sound now followed machinery rather than solar conditions. Markets opened when the bell rang. Work began and ended by signal. Gates closed according to schedule. Maintenance evolved into a specialized role. Clock keepers were responsible for winding, cleaning, adjusting, and repairing mechanisms. They also reconciled mechanical time with solar reality, religious calendars, and civic expectations. This reconciliation was imperfect and ongoing. Seasonal variation became an administrative problem rather than a live guide. Equal hours conflicted with daylight experience. Authorities adjusted schedules instead of clocks. Winter work days shortened unofficially, summer labour stretched, the clock remained unchanged. Failure points now carried consequences beyond inconvenience. If the clock ran fast or slow, wages were affected. If bells rang early or late, access to markets or city gates could be lost. Timekeeping errors became disputes. Long-term consequences accumulated slowly. Labour was increasingly defined by duration rather than output. Contracts referenced hours, penalties appeared for lateness, and time became enforceable. You can see the shift clearly. Time no longer belonged equally to everyone. It belonged most fully to those who controlled its signals. There is quiet irony in the outcome. A system created to coordinate life became a mechanism for regulating it. As evening approaches, the bell dictates closure, regardless of daylight. You are now standing at the edge of precision without fully entering it. Even as clocks spread, daily life did not immediately submit to minutes. Precision existed, but it did not yet dominate behavior. Time remained approximate, contextual, and flexible for most people. Historically, habit remained the primary organizing force. People woke up when it was time to awaken. Work began when others began. Meals occurred when food was ready. Exact alignment was unnecessary unless coordination demanded it. The transformation toward minute-based living was uneven. Urban centers adopted precision earlier. Rural communities resisted longer. Trades adopted it when wages depended on duration rather than output. Maintenance of minute precision required infrastructure. Personal timepieces had to be manufactured, carried, repaired, and synchronized. Public clocks had to align, and signals had to agree across distances. This system took generations to implement. Seasonal variation continued to resist control. Even with minutes, winter felt slower, summer felt extended. The body did not obey the clock without friction. Failure points that remained human were forgetting, ignoring, and quiet resistance. People arrived late and justified it with distance, weather, or fatigue. The system tightened gradually. Long-term consequences became cultural. As patience declined, waiting felt inefficient, silence felt unproductive, and time shifted from something experienced to something consumed. Looking backward, earlier systems appeared imprecise. Looking closer, they were adaptive. They absorbed failure rather than punishing it. The final contrast is simple. Accuracy increased over time as ease declined. You can sense what was lost as well as what was gained. For most of human history, time was something people noticed, shared, and adapted to. It was not something that constantly measured them. As rest arrives, the world finally grows quiet again. Well, look at that. You have just explored how time was organized before modern clocks, from sun-based systems and sound signals to early mechanical timekeeping and the long transition toward minutes and schedules. If you enjoyed this calm and detailed look at everyday historical time systems, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and ringing the notification bell so you do not miss future studies in boredom. New videos explore the quiet mechanics of past lives, ordinary work, forgotten systems, and the slow rhythms that shaped human history long before the modern world sped everything up. Thank you for spending your time here. Rest well and let the past keep watch. Good night from the archives.